How's it, Rob? Today we're going to be talking about Roberto Martinez and some of his achievements throughout his career. But starting with a trivia question, I wanted to ask you, can you tell me what year did Roberto Martinez win the FA Cup with Wigan, or what season?
Oh, what season was that? I'm gonna throw out. When did they go down? Because I really run the risk of looking like an utter idiot because I could be confusing it with like when they went into administration and had lots of problems. I'm gonna throw out 0910.
That's a some guess. I thought it was earlier as well, but it was actually 2013. So just over 10 years ago, on the 11th of May, Wigan defeated Manchester City to win the FA Cup. And then 3 days later, they lost to Arsene Wenger's Arsenal in the league, which relegated them down to the Premier League, or relegated from the Premier League down to the Championship. But speaking about Arsene Wenger's Arsenal, he's obviously known as a master in failure. And wouldn't it be an apt description to say if Arsene Wenger is the master of failure, then Roberto Martinez is the chronic underachiever?
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot, but I think it's one of those where, as a manager, obviously we have an understanding that managers almost find their level, and it's Roberto Martinez feels like a manager who found his level for a long time and then tried to push past it. When he was with it was Swansea, getting Swansea back in the Championship, and then Wigan, where he kept Wigan in the Premier League for ages, won an FA Cup with them. Um, he had that kind of career, and then he tried to push past that. And you see it in the international front where he went to Belgium and all that. And he feels like a manager who found his level 10 years ago and then refuses to accept it. And if you want to call that underachieving, then I guess you probably could call that underachieving. But I think it's more of a manager who's attempted to overachieve rather than a manager who's underachieved.
Well, the underachieving part comes from, so Wigan could be debated. You could argue, winning the FA Cup was obviously a huge overachievement. I'm not saying that's a debate, but then you look at getting relegated from the Premier League, and that's an underachievement. Whether Wigan was a small team or not, you go into the season wanting to survive relegation. But anything getting relegated is underachieving. Then he goes to Everton, and maybe this is a harsh statement, but from my perspective, Roberto Martinez's time at Everton was the start of the rot for Everton. That was the first time Everton moved out of that fifth, sixth position in the league every year and started coming like 12th mid-table, etc. And for me, that's where it all started for Everton. I'm not saying he's 100% to blame for Everton's downfall. I'm just saying that was the first consecutive seasons of finishing maybe lower than they should have. And then he goes to Belgium with the golden generation of Belgium, wins a total of 0 trophies, doesn't really come close, to be honest, in any of them. And now he's at Portugal, and time will tell how that goes. But so far, he hasn't lit the world on fire. And that's why I was saying he seems to be, particularly good at underachieving in a lot of the clubs he's been going to.
Yeah, I do. I sort of agree with you. I mean, the one thing I would say is with his Everton career, it kind of felt a little bit like, this is going to sound really funny, but he felt like the David Moyes of Everton. When David Moyes went to Man United, he took over from Alex Ferguson, who'd done all this great work with them. And he's one of the best managers of all time, let alone just in Man United's history. And David Moyes was consistently very good at Everton. He was a consistently good manager for Everton. And then they went through Roberto Martinez, and it felt a little bit like Everton dropped off. And I do agree with you. He probably, I wouldn't say he started the rot necessarily. I feel like the rot started in earnest when Ancelotti left Everton. I felt like that was the moment where Everton really, really fell. But the thing for me with Martinez is that he came into a position where David Moyes had overachieved a little bit with that Everton squad consistently. And then he inherited a team that probably deserved to be around that 10th, 11th spot. And unfortunately, that's what happened. And then they just end up in the situation where they are now. Whereas in Belgium, I feel like that's really an underachievement. I think Belgium was a huge underachievement in terms of the ability of those players. And I'm not entirely sure you can always blame underachievement on the manager alone. I think those players never played very well together, which is sad. But yeah, I think that Belgian team should have been in multiple big tournament semi-finals, if not finals, and should have won probably at least one trophy, and they just didn't do it. So he's underachieved massively on the international level.
Yeah, so we'll speak about some of the positive work he has done because it's always fair to show both sides of the coin. But before we get into that, one more point I wanted to make was it almost feels as if when he deals with the big players, he seems to struggle. And there's the evidence there is at Swansea, phenomenal job. And he got them not just one promotion, he got them two promotions. He really set them up for when they ended up coming to the Premier League. And even when he started at Everton, before making a few big purchases, he started really well at Everton as well. I'm skipping Wigan there. Obviously, Wigan, he did really well with that small club. And then he goes to Everton, does starts really well. But as soon as they almost spent a bit of money on some bigger players, he didn't get the best out of those players, and that's where it fell apart a little bit. Then he goes to Belgium, and he didn't quite click with Eden Hazard and players like that, getting them playing underneath him. Portugal's been interesting because the previous manager, who just left Portugal a few months ago, he dropped Ronaldo from the squad. He said Ronaldo's getting a bit older, we're going to play some other players. Martinez comes in, puts Ronaldo straight back in. Now, you could argue, look, he just thinks Ronaldo is one of the best players in the world, regardless of age. Part of me looks at that and thinks he almost gave in to a bit of player pressure or player power there. He goes, oh, it's Ronaldo, I have to put him back in. And to me, when I look across his career, almost the big weakness, because clearly tactically he's a very astute manager, etc. But not his player management but just the big player management would be his key weakness.
I do tend to agree with you there. I think he's a manager who works very well with teams, but not well with superstars. And I think this is where you start to see underachievers shine through a little bit, because a lot of them will come through in situations like Martinez with Swansea, where they bring through a relatively small team and they get the team playing so well, and then they start inheriting bigger sides. And the problem with inheriting bigger sides is that you've got bigger personalities, you've got bigger players to deal with, and I think there's a skill to being able to manage big players compared to managing a team, and that's where your top managers succeed. Your Jose Mourinho's, your Alex Ferguson's, your Pep Guardiola's. You look at those teams, you're like, they had fantastic teams, don't get me wrong, but there's always one or two standout players in those teams. Klopp had Salah with Liverpool. Ferguson, throughout his seasons, he had one or two players, whereas like that's the big play. It was Rooney, it was Beckham, it was Ronaldo. They had them, and there was always those kind of players around. And same with Mourinho. He had John Terry and he had Drogba, and it was one or two players where it's like they play well as a team, but they get the most out of that superstar player, and that's realistically what takes you from being a fourth to 10th team to a title challenging 1 to 3 team. I think being able to do that and have one player integrate with the squad while still keeping their superstar ability is something that Martinez has lacked in his career, and is definitely why we consider his international career specifically an underachievement.
Looking into some of the positives here, and there's got a question associated, but the question is, I'll start with that. The question is, where do you think Martinez would rank today as a Premier League manager? And then just to summarize, because I've given a lot of negatives here, again, he was the manager who got Swansea that back-to-back promotion. He did win an FA Cup with a tiny Wigan team, probably the smallest wage budget and transfer budget in the entire league. They only got relegated right at the end of the season. It wasn't like a Burnley from last season who just got blown out the water with like 10 games to go or something along those lines. And even though you could say underachieved at Belgium, it's cup football, and those matches can go either way. You're in a knockout game, bad referee decision, an individual player makes a bad decision in the moment and you're out the tournament. You don't get an opportunity to rectify that. So it might be a harsh thing to say, oh, he's just, no one's saying he's a terrible manager, but to go with that narrative would be short-sighted. So that's why I ask you, where do you place him as a Premier League manager at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would always give him credit for was with that Belgian team, they always cruised through the qualifying stages. There was never any blips. You were never worried about them potentially not making a big tournament. And I think that is a big part of international management. You have to get to the tournament to compete in the tournament. And there are managers who have failed that. Italy have done it. England have done it. Martinez has never did that with Belgium. So I will give him his credit there. In terms of where I rank him, I mean, realistically, he'd still come in. He'd still be one of the better managers in the Premier League. And I think the big thing for me is I wouldn't want to see him in a top squad. I don't think that's where he succeeds. I would probably rank him around that 8th to 12th. You know, I think if he could come into a Crystal Palace, I reckon he would take Crystal Palace to 10th pretty easily because they're a team who need need to be a team. You know, they need to stop relying on one or two players. They need to actually pull together as a team. Martinez could do that as a manager for them. So I would probably rank him in that mid-table 8th to 10th with some of those smaller teams. If he had to come in, I reckon he'd do a fantastic job of bringing them up that table.
Yeah, no, great point. And I really like what you said earlier, actually, about he always qualified with Belgium so easily. Because someone listening to this might think, oh, well, what do you mean? Belgium's going to qualify for every tournament. But as you said, there's been tournaments where Italy didn't qualify for a Euro World Cup. There's in recent times, Netherlands didn't qualify for one. It was, I can't remember if it was the Euro World Cup. England seemed to always, they always qualify, but they always seem to have this weird, they make it complicated every time. They lose to Greece at home or something, and then it gets all very complicated for no reason. So you're right about that they always cruise through the qualifiers. But anyway, this has been our take on Roberto Martinez. I'm really interested to know, as the listener, if you believe he's a chronic underachiever, if that title would be a fair analysis of his career or not. Anyway, love to hear your opinions. And until next time, this has been Football Unspoken. Cheers.